Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
My dear friend Ganesh Devi, who has given a lecture here earlier, in his book After Amnesia, argued that we had forgotten the poetics that was followed in the Middle Ages because the English has erased it. I had an argument with him, oral argument, as friends do, as friends must, and I also wrote a review of it saying, no, it's not after amnesia. There was no amnesia. There was nothing in the medieval literature of ours, in any language, that did not derive its poetics from Sanskrit or from Persian.
In this episode, Professor Harish Trivedi will explore the challenges that complicate any effort to write a history of Indian literature. His work self-reflexively examines several such histories, including a recent volume, Indian Literary Historiography, published by the Sahitya Akademi in 2024. Professor Trivedi proposes radical ideas for writing a popular history of Indian literature in about 250 pages, and discusses a short history he authored in which pedantic conventions were deliberately set aside. This episode was adapted from the annual U.R. Ananthamurthy Memorial Lecture, which took place at the Bangalore International Centre in December of 2024.
I first knew Ananthamurthy, I think, in the 1980s, when what used to be called the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and which is now called the Prime Minister, not memorial anymore, some of them are living, and some of them will live on later, the museum and library. So Ananthamurthy was one of the persons from literature who was invited. Ravinder Kumar wanted history and literature both to be represented in their 4-day, 5-day conferences. And he invited, I think, 5 or 6 us literature professors to participate time and again in their deliberations. And that made a tremendous impact on me. For two disciplines to come together like this, the practitioners of those disciplines with their own kinds of papers and so on. So that's where I got to know Ananthamurthy first. And then, of course, we met time and again, and he used to come to Delhi. I was not such a frequent visitor here. I went to Dhanya Loka very often, passing via here. What does one remember about Ananthamurthy? The first thing that one remembers, those of us who had the joy of knowing him, one remembers how he greeted one, which was with a tight, long embrace. There was no handshake, there was no namaste. It was what, I don't know, some Sanskrit words have different meanings in different languages. It was alingan. And Vivek and I were talking about, that represented the man. That brought out the essence of the man, the warmth and the closeness. And Vivek and I were talking about it a couple of years ago, how tight the embrace was and how long it lasted depended on several factors. One, of course, was how close you were to him. Another was how long had it been since you last met him. There were other factors too. I always felt enviously that there was a gender element in it as well, but we shan't go into that. Another thing that connected me with Ananthamurthy was there's a kind of a bond which developed because he spent 3 or 4 years at the University of Birmingham in the UK, where he did a PhD and where he wrote Sanskara. About 20 years later, I too spent 3 years at the University of Birmingham. So there is a kind of a remembrance of the same people, some of the same people, the same places, especially in a foreign land. Even here, even in India, if you have lived in a place where not many other people have also lived, amongst people you know, there's a kind of a, what in Sanskrit is called Badarayana Sambandh, which is, I see that in front of your house, there is a plum tree. 1,000 miles away where I live, in front of my house, there is also a plum tree. So our being in Birmingham together, it was a bit better than that. We knew some of the same people like David Lodge, Malcolm Bradbury, whom I knew later, James Boulton, and so on. But that's incidental. His works, his generosity, his spontaneity. I thought, a day will come, as I said, when people who did not know Ananthamurthy personally will come and give this lecture. I hope. But while some of us who knew him are here, talking about Ananthamurthy and talking about anecdotes, incidents about him in Bangalore is like carrying coals to Newcastle. There are so many of you who knew him extremely well every day, met him every week or something. But I narrate these episodes because there is a moral in these tales. There's a larger point that I'm trying to make through each one of these episodes that I'll briefly mention to you. Somehow it all clusters around 1993-94, except some other later incidents. In 1993, he became the president of the Sahitya Akademi. That's a wonderful time. What had he not been? He was the kind of writer who was tailor-made, people thought, people who make these appointments, for roles that were enabling to others also in the field. He was the chairman of the National Book Trust. He was the president of the Sahitya Akademi. He was the director of the Film and Television Institute for 3 terms. He was the vice chancellor of 2 or 3 universities. So those are also part of his contribution to our public life, apart from the books. He was also, of course, a public activist, and he was a public intellectual. He was an interventionist, not only a writer sitting in his study and writing books. So he had a kind of a role to play in our life, in our society, which went just beyond being a writer. Now, in 1993, he was elected, is one of the few posts to which he was elected by a group, something that's called the General Council, which comprises writers from all the languages of India, who themselves have been elected to come there. And he was elected, which is a greater honor than being selected or nominated by the government. And the first time I met him in his office, shortly afterwards, he said, "Harish, now I'm going to have a deep lasting regret for the rest of my life." And I said, "What?" And he said, "Now I can never win the Sahitya Akademi Award." That's the kind of perspective he had, the sense of humor that he had. Among the many, many awards that he did win, some of which Vivek has mentioned, the Sahitya Akademi Award is not won because of this wonderful reason. 1992 had just happened when he took over. And because he played all these roles that I have enumerated before you, he thought the Sahitya Akademi should do something to awaken awareness, to protest. And then we talked about it many times. Another person whom he consulted very frequently was Shishir Kumar Das, the great historian of Indian literature. And he decided that we should hold a panel discussion in which Shishudas and I and he will speak, and we'll all discuss a novel which defines the nation in a new, liberating kind of way. And the novel that he decided on the discussion was Gora by Tagore, in which at the end of the novel, as you recall, Gora says, all Indians are equal to me. I abandon all restrictions that were prevalent. The novel was published in 1910. Everybody's water is my water. I will drink it. Everybody's food is my food, and so on. No distinctions. So he chose that novel, and we all spoke on it. And afterwards, we went to his office, and he was very annoyed with me. These are the incidents one recalls, even more than his being happy with me. Because there is real deep engagement. Because I had said this novel, Gora says all that at the end, but Gora is a white man who throughout the novel is taken to be an Indian. And at the end, after he said all this, that is revealed, so it's a novel which depends on a trick of the plot. And therefore it cannot bear any kind of a sublime, all-encompassing message like this. What I wish to point out here is, who am I and who was Ananthamurthy? The gap was so tremendous in every which way. But he would listen, and he would argue, and he would present his case, and he'll try and refute your case. That's part of the greatness of truly great people, that they meet you on the level, and they listen to you, and they engage with you. I will not go into which novel I suggested instead. I said that, the only novel that will heal, that will awaken people to a new kind of consciousness of what's going on at Babri Masjid, what happened there, would be a novel in which the differences between the Hindus and the Muslims are openly stated, nakedly and brutally stated, and yet artistically resolved at the end. There are not too many novelists who do that. We are all squeamish about that problem. I don't know many novels which did that, but I suggested one by Rahi Masoom Raza. No, I shan't go into it. There's a lot more to say. In 1993 or 94, he did another thing as the president of the Sahitya Akademi. There is a Sahityotsav, the annual festival of letters that is held in Delhi in March, now a little earlier, every year. That's their biggest event. And Ananthamurthy is held every year in Delhi, where the head office is of the Sahitya Akademi. Ananthamurthy decided to bring that festival to Bangalore. He faced a lot of criticism. People said it's not practicable, it can't be done, and so on. I remember one person even saying to him, "You're going to be like Muhammad bin Tughlaq," moving the capital to the south, to the center. But he went ahead. Once he decided to do these things, he'd go ahead and do them. And we all came here. It was a magnificent venue, the town hall. And there were crowds, and there was a book mela, and there were all kinds of ancillary events. And who was not here? If Ananthamurthy invites you, how could you not be here? And I was what in Hindi is called a labharthi of government schemes, the doles that are given out, all kinds of subsidies. I was a major labharthi of that. In Delhi, where I've lived, I had lived then quite a few years. I've lived all my life, for the last 50 years. Nobody takes any notice of me. But I came here and people began taking notice in a way that only can happen in a very literary city. In a city imbued with the sense of value of literature. And I found that not only, there were people meeting me and talking to me all the time with very keen interest, But I achieved the summit of my fame all those years ago, 1994, when I was walking into the auditorium and I overheard two young persons saying to each other, "Oh, we must go and listen to Harish Trivedi." I mean, who was I? But then the Deccan Herald came. And the Deccan Herald interviewed me, and the Deccan Herald interviewed Ejaz Ahmed, two persons. And I thought, okay, interview, fine, small thing somewhere. The whole front page of the magazine and part of the next page. And many photographs. And Ejaz Ahmed and I had we knew each other already. We had a bit of a joke about it. We were asked to go out for a photo shoot. A photographer had come. It never ever happened to me before or after. And all because of Ananthamurthy bringing the festival here. Ejaz Ahmed, as we were rather sheepishly walking back into the auditorium after the photo shoot, he said to me, "Harish, I know you're more handsome, but let's see who comes out more photogenic." So the kind of things that Ananthamurthy facilitated, this is part of it. And he was equally full of regard and affection for authors of every shade, irrespective of his own strong political convictions in the matter. Since I'm praising myself as much as I'm praising Ananthamurthy, let me narrate one other episode. In 1993, I published my first book, Colonial Transactions. It came out from a publisher in Calcutta, small publisher in Calcutta. I think they've folded up now. They were so small. It was reprinted later in the UK as well, but that's a different thing. And I gave a copy to Ananthamurthy. He used to come to Delhi for Sahitya Akademi affairs, but he was a visiting professor at the JNU for one semester. And one day he phoned me and he said, "Harish, I've read your book." And he said, "Come and have a look at my copy." I said, "Why?" He said, "Come and count the places where I have written rogue, rascal." That's what he said. That's his way of showing that he had enjoyed reading the book. And then he went on saying good things about it. And then he paused, and then he said, "Harish, I think you're the best critic in India." I did not say thank you. I did not say it's very kind of you. I just began to laugh. It was so absurd, that statement. Said out of the warmth and kindness of his heart, I just couldn't relate to that. So I began to laugh. Then he also began to laugh. And he said, he knew that I was not going to accept that. So he said, "There is also D.R. Nagaraj, but his English is not so good." I loved that. So I said, I'd never heard of Nagaraj. But I said, "Who's this Nagaraj? Give me his address, and I'll come and I'll shoot him. And then without doubt, I will be the best critic in India." Ram Guha, when Nagaraj passed away much too quickly, he wrote an article narrating this episode, and in the Hindu, I think. And then I wrote an article a couple of weeks later called "Looking for Nagaraj." I should finally come to my topic. I've chosen to talk about it because I've already written a literary history of India. Nobody knows about it, nobody has seen it, so I'm quite safe so far. Let's see what happens in future. It's been published. Even the title that I'm using, "How Not to Write a History," is borrowed, is a quotation from Ralph Russell, who taught Urdu in SOAS, London, a great scholar of Urdu. He wrote an article called "How Not to Write a History of Urdu Literature." And he pointed out many things that were wrong with histories of Urdu literature. But the main thing that he pointed out was that whenever people say, "Here is a great Urdu writer," they say, "Oh, he's like the Shelley of Urdu." He's like the Keats of Urdu. He's like the Byron of Urdu. And this Englishman told us that this is the most colonial way of praising Indian authors. Actually, in this book, which I reviewed last year, I think, The Essential Ananthamurthy, there is an article about the literary situation in India, Search for an Identity, that's the title, by Ananthamurthy, in which he points out that even in Kannada, Bendre and Putina and Masti were similarly compared to British authors. That was the ultimate sanction. And therefore, this colonial practice had to be replaced, and we had to develop the confidence to praise these authors in their own terms without comparisons which are not flattering to them, which actually bring them down, though we mean it otherwise. When Sir William Jones began it, in 1789, when he translated the Shakuntalam, Abhijnana Shakuntalam, in his preface he said, Kalidas can fairly well be called the Shakespeare of India. And in the 1930s, there was an Indian critic living and writing in London, Ranji Shahani, who said, no, this is wrong. Kalidasa lived 1,000 years before Shakespeare, so Shakespeare should be called the Kalidasa of England. Now that was the kind of post-colonial protest that we just ignored ever since William Jones. We actually propagated it. So that's one of the many things, how not to write a literary history. Let's move out of the shadow of what the Western scholars, some of them Orientalists, some of them not, did to us. The problem is, before the British came, we did not have literature in India and we did not have history in India. I'm not running India down here. I'm hoping to make a somewhat subtler distinction. What they call literature was untranslatable for us. We did not have one word with which to identify that. And what they called history was something they had manufactured out of their own preconceptions. For a very long time, and here is one of the books that I published this year, one of the 3 books actually, Indian Literary Historiography. I've only edited it. There are 20 authors in it. And if I'm plugging it, let me also state that I don't get any royalties. It's published by the Sahitya Akademi. They pay you 5,000 or 7,000 in the beginning and nothing afterwards, nothing related to the sales. It's a very good book. I've only edited it. There are 20 other authors. There's more that I've learned from this one book about Indian literary history than from any other book. So, what are people doing here? People are recounting the histories of their own individual literatures, written by the Englishmen initially. Sanskrit, the first 10 histories of Sanskrit literature are written by Germans and Britishers. Germans also. There is a statement by Michel Foucault, which Edward Said adopted, and it became even more current. Knowledge is power. No, not always, not in all contexts. The British in India had all the power, and for 100 years, the Germans had all the knowledge. The way they studied India and Indian literature and culture was unparalleled. So there is a kind of disinterested interest also, nothing to do with power politics, which the Germans practiced, and they are the ones who have written all the early histories of Indian literature, from Weber in the 1850s to Winternitz towards the end of that century and later on. Winternitz is still supposed to be gold standard for a study of Indian literature. What did they do though? All of them thought that Sanskrit literature was Indian literature. They did not pay any heed to any other literature of the country. The two were synonymous for them. And it's not only Orientalism, it's something else. I've come to understand it only lately, because then, when these people were writing, the only literature that was studied all over Europe and even in Britain in the universities was what they call the classics. Only Greek and Latin. So that was the mindset through which they thought that the only literature worth studying, worth writing about, was old classical literature. That's one of the reasons. So, there's again a bias that needs to be corrected. And their idea of literature, just one example, they said in Sanskrit there is kavya, which is highly artificial, highly elevated, nothing to do with real life, rhetorical, too much rhetoric, too much alankara, and so on. When I say that we didn't have a word for what they call literature, this is what I mean. Kavya in Sanskrit means all kinds of writing, including prose, gadya kavya, we say. So, as is pointed out by Radha Vallabh Tripathi in the chapter on Sanskrit in this book that I've edited, Indian Literary Historiography, they did 2 or 3 things. They reduced the antiquity of Sanskrit literature. It's not as old as we claim it to be. Why? Because Greek literature must be seen to be older. There's always that kind of implicit competitiveness in these matters. They have sworn by Greek literature all their lives throughout the 2000 years of that Western civilization, and now they don't want to be upstaged. Number 2, they did not have the same generic variety that Sanskrit has. So they reduce and collapse the many genres of literature that Sanskrit had. And of course, there are many other instances where they simply misunderstand or misrepresent. About history, there is another problem. These are the problems in understanding our literature that they had. Any foreigner would, but they spoke from superiority, a position of superiority, which complicated matters further. As about history, what did we have? James Stuart Mill made fun of the fact that Indians had no sense of history. He said, we find references to King Yudhishthir ruling for 27,000 years. That can't be history. After that, Macaulay, of course, made tremendous fun, citing some of the same Puranas in his Minute on Education. And then 100 years, so 70, 80 years after Macaulay, there came along Anthony MacDonald, A.A. MacDonald, who wrote, again, a history of Sanskrit literature. And in that, in the beginning, he said, Indians did not write any history because they did not make any history. In my introduction to this book, I've called this the Mill, Macaulay, MacDonald mockery. The idea that they entertained of history, and literary history, of course, has to be both a definition of literature and a definition of history being brought together. Both of these concepts were so radically different in their minds from what we understand by it. I will cut this long story short. I've written about this not only here but also elsewhere. Now, even Indian critics of a certain persuasion who used to dismiss the Puranas, dismiss Ramayana and Mahabharata both as not being itihasa, though one of them is called itihasa traditionally in Mahabharata, who did not consider these as any kind of reliable narrative. They have come round. One example, person I know, person I have high regard for, Rumila Thapar. In a late book called The Past Before Us, she has now acknowledged that there have been 2 kinds of history. one that we can derive from the Puranas, which have Vanshavalis which are impossible, which have reigns of kings that are impossible, but they do tell us something which is historically useful. She has acknowledged that the Puranas and the Mahakavyas, the epics, also have history. And of course, literature has history. Mudra Rakshas, for example. And she says there are two kinds of history, and it's a major advance from that school of of historians. The two kinds of history. And one is externalized, embodied history, her phrase, and the other is implicit, embedded history. And in literature in the Puranas and including the Mahakavyas, we have embedded history. Historical accounts written as history are one kind of historical account, and they are embodied history that you can see to be history. So there are many of these considerations to keep in mind. I shall now quote a little passage from somebody who has earned a totally different kind of reputation in India. Not all of it to her own liking. Wendy Doniger. Wendy Doniger, in the book which created some problems for her, An Alternative History of the Hindus, she says, this book, and they're still going on with it, this book attempts to set the narrative of religion within the narrative of history as a linga is set in a yoni. You're going to have problems if you write like this. You are asking for it. And I think she does from time to time. I knew Wendy, I taught in Chicago, as was mentioned, and Wendy Doniger has taught all her life in Chicago. And she's a South Asianist, and I was in that department. But there is a kind of a compulsive tick that she has. There is an article here on Telugu literature, histories of Telugu literature, by Muralidhar Rao. Teaches Telugu in a college where he is the only teacher of Telugu. In Delhi, what else would you expect? And fantastic scholar of an older kind. I was told by some of the people who know him that he is actually a Shatavadhani. He still maintains that tradition, demonstrably. So, he has mentioned, in his consideration of Telugu literature, that we have something called avatarika. It may be new to many of you. It was new to me when I read his draft. Avatarika is not literary history, but many writers, and even in Telugu, not only Sanskrit, they mention major predecessors that have written already. That is a sense of living history that they present, not chronology, not writers whom you don't care for, which are also part of history, but the writers who made you a writer. So there is an avatarika in the beginning, not like the colophon in Western works at the end. That is our history. Kalidasa, writing his first play, and I again go back to Sanskrit, Kalidasa in his first play says, the Sutradhar comes, the Nat and the Nati, and they say, what are we performing today for this wonderful sophisticated audience, which is of course metadrama. Everybody has already decided what they are performing. Everybody has rehearsed it, but it begins like that with a frame for the play. And he says, today I think why don't we present for this wonderful audience a play by a new playwright? There are, of course, great playwrights whom we can perform, But here is the new playwright, and let's give him a chance. Who's writing all this? Kalidasa is writing all this as the new playwright. But Kalidasa there mentions two poets who have gone before, and the Natta and the Natti says, why don't we perform something by them? Established figures. One of them is called Saumilla, and the other is called Kaviputra. And I'll be very surprised if you have read a single play by them, because no single play by them has yet been found. They are lost to obscurity. Now that is Avatarika. That is our literary history with so many gaps, with so many omissions. But there also, if there is a single reference like this, especially by Kalidasa, they are part of our history. They are part of the Avatarika. Let me mention one or two other points. Ramanujan made a wonderful distinction. It doesn't hold all the time, but he at least coined a phrase which nobody can forget who has once read it. Father languages and mother languages. The three father languages of India are Sanskrit, Persian, and English. They are right at the top. They are pan-Indian, or they were pan-Indian, and below are the mother tongues. It's not that they are below in hierarchy, but the status given to them traditionally has been below. I think a slight modification is needed. I do not propose to overvalue Sanskrit or overvalue English, but I think we have 2.5 father tongues. The influence of Persian was not that great. It did not permeate in the way that Sanskrit permeated, which reigned for a much longer period, and English, because literacy and print had come in by the time English was being taught. So it reached a much wider field. Persian remained a courtly language. The language that became popular was a progeny of Persian, not Persian itself, Urdu, which of course is a different case of influence, because then Persian doesn't remain Persian. It's the special case. English Geetagalu, published here in 1920, what does the translator say? He says, in Kannada, let us now desist from following Sanskrit models and let us try and see English literature in the place of Sanskrit literature and enter modernity. Not modernity in the present sense. Those are romantic lyrics from the Golden Treasury that he translates. But look at the tradition that he formulates. Sanskrit to English. And in many, many languages, in many sub-traditions, perhaps in the mainstream as well, that was the transition. My dear friend Ganesh Devi, who has given a lecture here earlier, in his book After Amnesia, argued that we had forgotten the poetics that was followed in the Middle Ages because the English has erased it. I had an argument with him, oral argument, as friends do, as friends must, and I also wrote a review of it, saying, no, it's not after amnesia. There was no amnesia. There was nothing in the medieval literature of ours, in any language, that did not derive its poetics from Sanskrit or from Persian. There was no separate medieval practice. If there was something that can be distinguished clearly from the older Sanskrit, what happened was the Sanskrit traditions began to be seen as less rewarding. They had lasted too long. They were dead from inside, and that's why there was need for change. So there are some of these, many questions to be taken into account when one begins to think about Indian literature. I'll give one example which illustrates many of these issues. This will show the importance of Persian. Don't think I'm negating it. Premchand. Premchand is one of those iconic figures. When his birth centenary was being celebrated in 1980, I went to the Sahitya Akademi big show in Delhi. Umashankar Joshi, the Gujarati poet, was the chairman of the Sahitya Akademi, and he said, Premchand is among the Panch Devata of modern Indian literature. That's where he placed him. Now let's look at Premchand and the literary representation, the literary tradition that he represents, and the cross currents that are reflected in him personally and also in our larger literary life on a bigger scale. He was born a Kayast. People now hate to say what their caste is. Ananthamurthy, let me quote at least one passage. Ananthamurthy in this book says, in the same essay that I mentioned, he says that people now are indirect about it. Earlier, it was clearly mentioned as to which caste a person belongs to, a writer belongs to, in all the histories. In fact, there is a history in Gujarati literature in which the author says writers can be divided into three categories: Sattvic, Rajasic, and Tamasic, which is even better. But caste was very much a factor in what you wrote and how you wrote it. And Ananthamurthy says in this essay, nowadays we dare not ask each other what your caste is. So we say, so who was your grandfather? And we say, so where do you come from? Where is home? And trying to deduce it rather than saying it. Now, what the point here is, we are all cultural formations of our times. Our own consciousness of it and other people's awareness of it differs from age to age, but there are some things that are very difficult to erase and eradicate, and their importance must be recognized. The greatest history of Hindi literature, published in 1929 by Ramchandra Shukla, very quickly states the caste right in the beginning of all the writers. Premchand's caste was Kayast. Kayast does not belong to one of the four Varnas. They are a later, I was going to say invention, but a later fact, later construction. Premchand was brought up in a village, but that did not stop him from writing in Urdu. One fact about Urdu is it's never spoken in any village in North India. It's not only a courtly language, it's an urban and urbane language. Compared with that, many supporters of Urdu said that Hindi is the Gamar language, is a rustic language. And it's true. It's true. But if there are 10 times as many Gamars as there are courtly people, then that also has to be recognized. That is a weight of its own. That was and is the strength of Hindi. That the rusticity that some other courtly languages might have renounced earlier still persisted in Hindi for a very long time. It's not necessarily a handicap. So Premchand began writing in Urdu. He did a BA late in life as a private candidate, and the three subjects that he chose were English literature, Persian, and history. He knew his Persian all right. But it was confined to Kashmiri Brahmins and to Kayasts. Let me name castes. It's vital for us to understand this. There were other Hindus also who knew Persian. All the government jobs depended on knowing Persian and Urdu. Same reasons as knowing English now. So he began writing novels in Urdu in 1905, and his first novel was called Asrar-e-Maabid, and anybody who understands the title here is a genius. There was another novel was called Jalwaye-Isar, And another one was called Hum Khurma or Hum Sawab. These are the titles of his early novels. Later, beginning around 1915 up to 1924, it was a long process, he switched to Hindi. This is not only Premchand. This is that whole cultural world of North India undergoing a seismic shift. Premchand is only the lightning conductor. He was many times asked why he had moved. And one reason was very obvious. His fifth novel was called Bazar-e-Husn. And though he had published many novels, though he was highly acclaimed in Urdu, he could not find a publisher for it. Why? Because in the year 1900, people say the Hindutva has killed Urdu. People say nationalism has killed Urdu. No. Let's go a bit further back. Nobody has killed Urdu. It has 50 million speakers. That's one thing. It's number 6 or 7 in the list, I think. So even now, the Lieutenant Governor of the United Provinces passed an order in April 1900 that Urdu will remain to be the only language in which business would be conducted in government offices, including judicial courts, as it had been since 1835. But now, because the Urdu script could not be read by enough people, people will be submitted using the same language to submit their petitions and applications in the Nagari script. That's all that the order was. No mention of Urdu in Hindi. And Urdu immediately collapsed. The Urdu market fell. There was no publisher, even for Premchand. And a Hindi publisher got wind of it and he came, I'll publish it in Hindi. I'll give you 300 rupees. And the Urdu novel, same novel, remained unpublished for many more years. If this can happen to Premchand, this is what will happen to Urdu in Hindi. Bazar-e-Husn in Hindi is published as Seva Sadan. I've given you the titles of some of his early novels which were in Urdu. Now let me give you some titles from the later period, Premchand's. Karma Bhumi, Ranga Bhumi before that, Kaya Kalp, Godan. These are the titles. These are different worlds. But there is a few years ago, K. Sachidanandan took me to an event in Kerala. I was very impressed. They were celebrating the centenary of a writer, Divakaran Potti, who was not a writer, he was only a translator. In how many languages in India would you celebrate the centenary of a writer who is not a writer but merely, as we say, a translator? I was thrilled to go. He translated many novels by Premchand, so I was asked to go. I know a bit more about Premchand than I know about many writers. Having translated his biography, Sahitya Akademi award-winning biography from Hindi into English. So I went there and I asked some people. I said, he translated all these novels, Premchand. What titles did he give them? I can't read them in Malayalam. And I was told that Karma Bhumi and Ranga Bhumi remain the same. I was also told that Seva Sadan is Seva Sadanam. I was told that Godahan is Godanam. People say Hindi is being Sanskritized all the time. I mean, look at this. Other languages are far more Sanskritic, even though they're Dravidian, so-called. Even that category is now collapsing. This is the discovery. One title of a later novel by Premchand had to be changed in Malayalam by Divakaran Potti. The title is Gaban. Gaban is the Urdu Persian word. It won't do in Malayalam. So it's called Vanchana. But the last episode from Premchand's extremely illustrative life I narrate these episodes as emblems of the changing cultural and literary history of India over his lifetime. In 1934, he accepted a contract to write for films in Bombay. He made a fair bit of money, but he said nobody pays any respect to a writer here, and nobody has any regard for the script that the writer submits. It can be changed in every scene. So he said, I'm going home now. Before he went home, he'd never been as far south as Bombay. Now we take for granted people traveling all over the place, all over the globe. So he decided to come to South India, what still called in an undistinguished marker South India, all over the north. He came to Bangalore, he came to Mysore. In Bangalore, he met, there was Hindi Pracharani Sabha. So they were looking after him and they were holding functions for him and so on. So they pleaded with him to go and meet Mirza Ismail and to plead the cause of promoting Hindi in the state. And he listened, and Premchand said, no, he's not going to do anything about it. I can sense that. Because he thinks that Urdu is a bigger language, and Muslims are more sophisticated, and Hindus don't know anything. It can't be true what he reports. But that's the impression he carried away. Then he went to Mysore, and a meeting was arranged between him and the then head of the Sanskrit department in Mysore University. C.R. Narayana Shastri, I think his name is. And because Premchand was coming, he called many other major literary figures to his house, and they all met. And after namaskara, as we say in Hindi, they settled down to talking about literature. And all of them were speaking in Sanskrit and quoting one shloka after another. As Amrit Ray's youngest son of Premchand wrote in his biography, which I mentioned, Premchand ki to Sanskrit se bhet nahi hui thi. He'd never met Sanskrit. So he was totally bewildered, he was shocked out of his mind, and he said, Khuda khuda karte to bahar nikle. He ran for his life from that. This is happening in 1934, here in Karnataka. And Premchand had no idea. So there are many, if one decides to write any kind of a narrative of Indian literature, these are some of the forces, some of the developments, some of the markers from our own times, from the 20th century. To say nothing of the earlier times. Now, how do I find a place to stop? Yeah, let me see. Yeah, let me move to the last part. After independence, there was a great awareness that we should, in an organized way, in a government-supported way, enlightened way, do something about our literatures and spread knowledge about them and so on. Jawaharlal Nehru's vision, all-encompassing vision of development, what's now become a dirty word, development of Vikas. He established the 3 academies. Also because he was influenced by the Soviet Union, by the Marxist model. Governments don't establish literary academies in the West. They do so only in communist countries. And then the academies register you as a member and they tell you precisely what to write. Nehru wanted another kind of academy here, more liberal academy, more democratic academy, and he established the academy. Not only did he establish the Sahitya Akademi, he also accepted to be its president initially for some years. Personal investment in the literature of India. One of the first things he said was, there should be a history written of each literature in the 14 languages that were then part of the 8th schedule. Only 14 then, 22 now. Increased gradually from 14 to 16 to 18 to 22. And Sahitya Akademi now recognizes 24 languages, 2 more. So the first history to be published was from Bengali by Sukumar Sen. And Nehru himself wrote a preface to it. So now there are histories of individual literatures published by the Sahitya Akademi of almost every language. Hindi was one of the last to be published and is the most terrible of all. We Hindiwalas, what can I say? Let me hold my tongue on that. That is the Sahitya Akademi model. I have called it that. They don't call it that. Nobody else has called it that. The Sahitya Akademi model of writing literary history. But when it comes to writing a history of Indian literature, how do we proceed? Shall we still have separate compartments for each language? We had a volume for each language. No. There is an encyclopedia of Indian literature which solves the problem by going alphabetically. But there are anthologies of Indian literature, 10 volumes, huge anthologies, and they go by language. They go by region and language, and period, of course. All the histories that have been written of Indian literature that I know in the post-independence period follow the Sahitya Akademi pattern, the government pattern, if I may so call it, that each language gets equal space and they're arranged within a book in a non-controversial order, which is the Roman alphabet. Assamese, Bangla, and so on. Right at the end, Sanskrit, Tamil, Urdu. So that's the order. In the history that I wrote, I said, no, I'm not going to do any of that. And of course, if the Sahitya Akademi brings out a volume on any subject, then all the languages have to be represented. In this one, there are 20 languages. No, not even 20, 16 or 18 languages represented here, which is a very high figure. Because not for all books do you get the right material and the right writers. But this is a high representation. In most books, it's like that. I said I'm going to do, even in this book, Indian Literary Historiography, I said I'm not going to follow the alphabetical order. I'm going to follow the chronological order so that some history is revealed. The oldest languages first and then the younger languages. And the officials at the Sahitya Akademi said, no, it can't be done. We've never done it. I said, it can be done and I will do it. And it's one of the two innovations that I have made in this book. But how did I myself get to write a history of Indian literature? I said, one thing, I will write all of it. I will not have 24 people writing it. It's also because there was a history of world literature being written in Stockholm by an international team. And I was invited to be the member from India on that team. And foreigners don't care which language you know and which language you don't know. Why? Because they have one nation, one language. They can't imagine what goes on here. So, initially I invited collaborators from other languages, and all of them refused. They said, you're writing a history of world literature, sitting together in Stockholm. It'll never happen. It's impossible. I'm not going to waste my time with it. Some of the greatest scholars of Indian literature, separate languages, in India and in America, told me that. I got so cheesed off, I said, all right, I know only 4 languages. 2 Indian languages well, Hindi and Sanskrit, and 2 not so well, Urdu and Bangla. And I don't know all the other languages, but I know many people who don't even know 4 languages. And with Sanskrit, You come up to the year 1200, except for Tamil. That's a tremendous advantage. And I said, if I can bluff about 6 languages, why can't I bluff about 24 languages? There are many ways of writing a history. I told myself I will never mention a writer here, and certainly I will not quote a writer here whose writings I have not read in some detail. It has to be in translation, and I've kept to that. And I will not go by language. Why did Nehru decide to go by language and give equal space to every language? One can't imagine it now. The nation was in danger of falling apart every passing day. There were so many dissensions. There was a National Integration Council, of which the Prime Minister was the chairperson, and it met several times a year. Just to prevent such a thing, the country had just been divided. That was the spectre looming large in Nehru's mind and the minds of all the national leaders. So the country had to be kept together. And how would you do that? By granting everybody equal rights, by preserving the identity of each one. I said, yes, that's a fine model. It serves its purpose, but let's try something else. I said, I will not go by languages. Shishir Kumar Das is the greatest historian of Indian literature. He wrote 3 volumes. He was my friend, my colleague at the University of Delhi, and for some years my neighbor in the university campus. I have read so many histories of Indian literature. I have talked to so many experts here and elsewhere in the world about Indian literature. And I have no hesitation in saying at all that even though he had one disqualification, that he was a friend of mine, Shishir Kumar Das was the greatest scholar of Indian literature who has ever lived. That's how great he was. But in his 3 volumes of a history of Indian literature, now we are Sahitya Akademi is sponsoring a history of Indian literature, not Bengali, Odia, and so on. What would be the model? Will it be an integrated history? In the initial proposal, he called it an integrated history of an integrated history of Indian literature. As one of the contributors in my book, Indian Literary Historiography, points out, People don't want integrated now. People want diversity. People want plurality. People want different constituencies to be represented. And she said, on the basis of 2 Marathi histories that have been written of that literature, she says actually it works out to either integrated or disintegrated. It's a very fine formulation. So on the one hand, you have unity in diversity. That was the formula for a very long time in everything, including literature. Radhakrishnan, ekam sat vipraha bahudha vadanti. We're talking about the truth in the Upanishads. Radhakrishnan is talking about literature. But the wonderful thing there is, vipraha bahudha vadanti. The truth is one, and it's not as if one person knows how to tell it, and all the others are fools. No. The wise people, each one of them describes it differently. That's the beauty of that mantra from the Upanishads. One truth can be told in so many different ways, unlike in many other traditions of the world. And that was sought to be applied to this. So I said, all right, what have I, in world literature, within that frame, if I write this, let me experiment. Let me move away from this. Let me just follow the flow of time. Let me follow innovation. Let me follow new developments from whichever language, without acknowledging, but without unduly emphasizing and compartmentalizing the fact that it comes from a certain language. I'll read out a little bit from what I've written in this book myself, which sums up the kind of approach that I adopted. And after that, I will really, honestly, truly try and finish. It's, yeah. I myself decided to go by period, theme, and genre. These were my guidelines, not languages. My focus was on new trends and movements as they historically emerged. Shishradas has a very fine Greek phrasing for how different, how new literary movements emerge. He knew Greek and he was showing off. And why not? All scholars show off. And that's why they're scholars. They have something to show off. Most of us can't. He called it profane and epiphane. Profane is, suppose the novel or the romantic lyric emerges in one of the Indian languages in the 19th century in a way that it hasn't emerged in the other languages. So that is an early manifestation, profane. And the other languages in which it appears later, not influenced by the first one, not necessarily analogous to the first one, on its own ground, in its own formulation. So, that is a fact to recognize and to follow. It's the flow of time. There, I said to him, why have you started one volume of your history in the year 1800? What happened in 1800 that had not happened in 1799? And he said, I'm sorry, I do argue with all my friends. And he said, you're very right. I could have called it 1790. I could have called it 1810. But then who would read it? If I call it 1800, everybody is impressed that there is something there. He said the press comes to India in the year 1800. I said, no, you're wrong. The press comes to Kashmiri in 1950. The press also is profane and epiphane. It doesn't come to all parts of India at the same time. We know that. So unless we are frightened by this fact into not recognizing difference, we have to go with this. I did not think it necessary in my history. It's a very short history. It's about 250 pages. In the number of words, it is 107,000 words, 107,000. If you set it at 400 words per page, it's only about 250 pages. Shishradas had conceived of a history of Indian literature that will run to 10 volumes, each volume about 1,000 pages. Well, somebody will read it someday, all of it. I don't know. It's not even been written. After Shishradas passed away prematurely in his 60s, nobody has dared touch any of the unwritten volumes. It's too big. It's too majestic. It's too magnificent. It's not for human use. So that also is a lesson. I was part of his team. I was part of 2 teams of writing histories of Indian literature. That's what emboldened me to set off on my own. Shishradas's team and Sheldon Pollock's team in Chicago. Literary constructions and history. So I learned my lessons. So I did not think it necessary to name, say, 4 prominent Bhakti poets from each of our 14, 18 or 22 languages. No. That way, you are not stating a significant development, you are stating facts without meaning. Nor did I try to identify the first novel in each language. Instead, I chose to discuss the poets and novelists who stood out for some innovative, distinctive, and influential feature of their work without unduly underlining which language they came from. If we are going to write a history of Indian literature, and if we keep sticking to the language of origin each time, we are not getting anywhere. The specificities are a matter of creed, the specificities of language. Only when we look at Indian literature while remaining firmly tethered to our own particular language and our linguistic identity. When Shishir Das wrote the first volume of a history of Indian literature, 1800 to 1910, he told me something that has stayed with me. He said, Harish, people are reading it, it's so gratifying. Some of the highest figures in Indian literature, some of the best writers and critics are reading it. What could be greater satisfaction or reward for me? And then he said, but how are they reading it? Even the best of them come to me and say, is wonderful, is great, but you have not given enough pages to Urdu literature, while you have given so much to Bangla literature. That too, allegation against him, he was the Bengali. And then he said, maybe I should not mention this, he said, even Ananthamurthy told me that I have not given enough pages to Kannada literature. What is enough? If you are tethered, as I said, to your own language and your linguistic identity, nothing is enough. Then write a history of just that language. Don't talk about India. But when seen from a broad enough perspective, the work becomes important. The work becomes more important than the language it originated in, especially if it gets disseminated into other Indian languages through a bilingual readership or through translation. A wood begins to take shape beyond the individual trees. A bird flying above may have such a view, or indeed a lion surveying his turf from a high vantage point. As we say in Sanskrit, Vihaga Avalokan, a bird's eye view, or Singha Avalokan. Mine was a Verma Avalokan. Worm is in English. I mean, how can I pretend even to be a bird, much less a lion? But I thought I'll do this. I felt far more like an insect, as I say. Kalidasa has, when he writes Raghuvansha, this dynasty descended from the sun, and me with my little mind. Kwa surya prabhavo vansha kwa chalpa vishayamati. 6 shlokas in the beginning. How impossible the task is. And yet he attempts it. Without that, we wouldn't have Raghuvansha. Given my approach, a major opportunity as well as challenge for me was to try and discern broad developments, interconnections, similarities, and differences across the literatures of various languages. The alternative, and I can name at least 10 histories, 15, 20 histories of Indian literature, which have Indian literature in the title, in which there are separate chapters by separate authors on each language. My friend Sujit Mukherjee used to say, these books are held together only by the binder's glue. There's nothing else holding them together. So, I have very foolishly attempted a different model. And the wonderful thing is that nobody has read it. It was published 2.5 years ago, and so far I'm safe. There are 2 things. Nobody can figure out easily how many pages I've given to which language, because I don't go by language. So that's one point of safety. Another is that it was published in 4 volumes, part of each volume. The volumes were divided by chronology from the beginning to 200 AD 200 AD to 1500 AD, 1500 to 1800, and 1800 to 2000. All the literatures of the world were divided like this, and in each volume, therefore, each macro region of the world, there were 6 macro regions that were devised, is represented. What I wish to do now is to consolidate these 4 different volumes, my contribution to these 4 different volumes, put them together, revise it in the light of what I've learned since I wrote those. 18 years that project took. And I had begun writing about my first article on Indian literature, and again Ananthamurthy and I talked about it, was published in 1993. That's more like 30 years. It's called Indian literature. Ananthamurthy and I, at a party given by J.P. Das, the Odia writer, used to give a party in the evening every year at the press club on the day the Sahitya Akademi awards were given. What a wonderful thing he was doing. And of course, so many writers were in town. On the first floor of the Press Club of India, he would have this party, and there'll be wonderful discussions all around, and that's where Ananthamurthy told me I should not have done it, written that article. For reasons I shan't go into, they're not as bad as you might imagine. So, what I wish to do now is to try and see if people will read it or would want to read it. Why has nobody read it? For that, I get royalty. There were 11 of us who were getting royalty, so my share is 0.9%. And I've already earned several $100s. How is that? Because the 4 volumes come in a set, and the set is priced $750. No wonder nobody has seen it in India. Not even the libraries can buy it. That's why I've been safe so far. But now I want to publish it in India as a consolidated and revised book. And I've got a publisher, and all I lack is copyright permission from the American UK publisher, Wiley-Blackwell. They have said no for 2 years. They have said no for 2.5 years. But I'll go on knocking on that door and pestering them. And if they still don't give me copyright permission, what do you think I should do? All opinions are welcome. Sorry, translate. Yeah, even translate. They hold the... Look at this penguin fellow. The Karthik. Copyright includes the right to translate. I've signed my soul away. So, but I'll find a way. I'm still hopeful. I'll find a way. In India, I've already got a publisher. They're very keen to publish it. They have been. Last time I met an editor, earlier this month, at a party in Delhi. She said, we are waiting. And I said, I'm also waiting for the copyright permission. I would love, for that, I may or may not earn royalty, I still don't know. Like for this Indian literary historiography, I don't want royalty. I want people to have a look at a 250-page book which tells them something or the other about Indian literature in a way that I think is Indian, in a way that the histories so far, wonderful as they are, magnificent as they are, have not even attempted to do. So that is how to write a history of Indian literature, and that is how not to write a history of Indian literature. Thank you very much.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you like what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna and Ishan Gupta on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarunaraj and Raghu Tenkaila. Artwork is designed by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.